Wet nursing, of course, is the practice whereby an infant is nursed not by his biological mother, but by some other lactating woman. Wet nursing was common throughout the pre-modern world, not just in the Middle Ages, but really this is a practice going back, far into antiquity. It was especially common among the upper classes. Wet nursing was practiced by the ancient Greeks and Romans, and in fact it was recommended in ancient Greek medicine. And of course, as we know, the medicine that was practiced by the Muslim, Christian, and Jewish physicians of the Middle Ages was based very closely upon ancient Greek medicine, in fact, with virtually no change. In one medical treatise from ancient Rome from the 2nd century, we get a description of the qualities that should be possessed by a good wet nurse. A good wet nurse should have a good constitution, a large frame. She should have a good color about her. Her breasts should be of a medium size. They should be lax, soft, and unwrinkled. And she should have a certain type of temperament. She should be self-controlled, sympathetic, not ill-tempered, and tidy. During the High Middle Ages, artisan mothers nursed their own children. But among aristocratic women, wet nursing was becoming increasingly common. For the most part, a wet nurse was brought into the home of the aristocratic family. And she would care for the child not only as his nurse, not only breastfeeding the child, but really as almost a governess. These wet nurses were really like a second mother. Many nobles generously endowed their nurses with substantial properties or incomes. Now, the church opposed the practice of wet nursing, and it was becoming very common by the 13th century. To discourage the practice of wet nursing, it was very popular in churches to have statues of the Virgin suckling the baby Jesus. So this was a way to encourage noble women to nurse their own children. Greco-Arabic medicine stressed that a nurse's health and temperament impacted the quality of her milk. We find this in Avicenna and in Maimonides, which is based closely on the work of Soranus of Ephesus from the 2nd century. Parents sought a clean and healthy young woman of good character to be the wet nurse to their child. She should get plenty of rest. She should abstain from salty, sharp, or acidic food, and she should avoid anxiety. Seems like good advice to me. The 13th century Parisian intellectual Bartholomew the Englishman wrote extensively about the qualities of a wet nurse. He described a wet nurse as essentially taking the place of a mother. She was happy when the child was happy. She was sad when the child was sad. She picks up the child when he falls. She nurses him when he cries. She teaches him to speak. She strokes him as he sleeps. She introduces him to solid food, and in fact will even soften it with her teeth. And she bathes and anoints the child. A wet nurse would be one of the most important members of a medieval household, and she really would become like an intimate of the family. She would become almost like another member of the family. Again, she is kind of like a second mother to the child. An example of this, we have a charter from King Alfonso VIII of Castile in which he rewards his butler, his armorer, and one of his daughter's nurses. By the time we get into the late Middle Ages, wet nursing has spread to the middle class in some areas. For example, Florence. In Florence, some wives of craftsmen acted as wet nurses to merchants and bankers, while they themselves would employ peasant women to nurse their babies. So this is kind of a less intimate arrangement than the aristocratic situation. In this case, the nurse generally did not live with the family, but the baby would be taken to the nurse's home. We have accounts of babies being transported to the home of their wet nurse in a basket, which is carried by a donkey and led by a servant. And in some circumstances, this baby could be living with his wet nurse for up to 18 months or more. The church was opposed to this practice. There was this idea that these babies might be absorbing bad traits from their nurse, picking up bad habits from their nurse. Michelangelo, for example, supposedly was put to nurse to the wife of a stonecutter, and he later joked that he had imbibed his artistic skill from his nurse's milk. Although the use of wet nurses was commonplace, there were still plenty of noble ladies who refused to use them. There were many noble women who insisted on nursing their own children. This often was, a sign of piety, So particularly pious or religious women would refuse to use wet nurses. They would be imitating the Blessed Mother, Jesus' mother. They would be nursing their own children. One example of this is Ida of Lorraine, who was in fact named a saint by the medieval church. She was the mother of two very important figures in medieval history, Godfrey of Bouillon and Baldwin I of Jerusalem. These were two important leaders of the First Crusade. These were the first rulers of Crusader Jerusalem. Ida of Lorraine insisted on nursing her own children. She wanted to keep them close to her. She wanted to impart piety and a devotion to God to them. If you were looking to get into a lot of trouble in the Middle Ages, one surefire way was to have an affair with a wet nurse. Wet nurses were not supposed to be having sex because, again, ancient Greek medicine stated that sex could contaminate breast milk. And so, therefore, it was very much frowned upon for a woman who was nursing a child to be engaging in sex. It was considered a type of poisoning, in fact, if you were to do this. In Castile, for example, the offending man in the situation might have to undergo trial by combat. He then could be forced to pay what was called the homicide fine. So this was a fine that was levied upon you if you killed someone. So very serious. And then he would be sent into exile. The nurse herself, same thing. She could be subject to the homicide fine and sent into exile. So this was a very serious thing. You didn't want to be doing this. Child neglect was taken very seriously in the Middle Ages. In many areas, it was quite stiffly punished. For example, in Castile, if you neglected to nurse your child or provide a proper wet nurse, you could be flogged. Men who fathered children out of wedlock were required to pay the mother the fee that would have gone to a wet nurse or to provide a wet nurse for the child. So we've been talking about wet nursing and the fact that wet nursing was commonplace, among the medieval aristocracy. So the question, of course, is why? Why were medieval noblewomen not nursing their own children? The answer is just that this was the health standard of the day. Again, as we were discussing, ancient Greek medicine was the standard for this period. And the idea was that a certain type of woman was suited to nurse a child. Certain constitution, certain physical build, certain temperament. So it could be that perhaps some medieval noblewomen were considered not qualified necessarily to nurse their own children. Now, the interesting thing about this is that wet nursing became increasingly common as we get into the High Middle Ages. It was less common in the early Middle Ages. And this coincides with the fact that, the High Middle Ages was a time when ancient learning, the ideas of the ancient Greeks, ancient Greek texts, ancient Greek medical treatises were becoming more widespread among, well-to-do society, among the aristocracy and the church. And this is, when this became even more common. So it's not always the case that, the opinions of the educated are the best. Sometimes folk wisdom can be superior. So this is one of those cases. It's not, not with everything, but in some cases. Of course, the other issue just was pregnancy itself. Medieval noblewomen wanted to get pregnant frequently. Aristocrats have dynastic concerns. They want to ensure that they have plenty of potential heirs. They want to ensure that they have, an abundant bloodline, plenty of people who can advocate for their bloodline. So they wanted to have many children. And, of course, the idea was that a child needed to be breastfed for 3 years. This was the standard according to ancient Greek medicine. So if a woman was going to get pregnant again within the next 3 years, she needed to not be breastfeeding her own child from her previous pregnancy. So we can kind of see how this worked. So yeah, this was just the thinking at the time. If you want to learn more about this issue, Daughters of the Reconquest, which is a book about women in Castilian town society from 1100 to 1300, so Reconquista era Spain, does deal with the issue of wet nursing. Also, Marriage and the Family in the Middle Ages, a classic, discusses wet nursing as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'll talk to you soon.